All right, welcome. This is Emily from This is Statistics, and we're so glad that you could join us today. We're thrilled that you're here, and we're excited to bring you this conversation on statistics, the superpower that every student needs. And you know, we're especially thrilled to be able to bring this to you from South by Southwest EDU, which unfortunately, of course, had to be canceled due to social distancing needs. But this and many other presentations will soon be available through their virtual events. And so this is a little bit of a sneak peek to that. And with all of that said, I will go ahead and welcome Rob Santos and Sam Echevarria and let you go ahead and kick us off. And oh, one more thing, please, if you've got questions throughout this, we welcome them. Please submit them through the chat bar on your screen. And I will be keeping an eye out for those, and we will read them out so that Rob and Sam can take those in the presentation. Go ahead.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Statistics, the superpower that every student needs. This is part of our South by Southwest presentation, South by Southwest EDU presentation. So thank you, EDU, for allowing us to get together with me and Sam and give you guys some really interesting stories on how to incorporate statistics into your students' lives. So we're going to have a little bit of fun today. As you can see, we've donned our cowboy hats. Bienvenidos, howdy partners. And we're both from Austin, Texas. Sam and I were both native Texans. I'm from San Antonio, and I'll let Sam tell you about himself. So let me first do some self-intros. We'll talk a little bit about what this session is going to be for the next hour or so. And then we'll launch into some interesting stories and maybe get some of your questions, and bam, we'll have some fun. So me, I'm Rob Santos, born and raised in San Antonio, Texas, Pueblito de mi vida. And I'm a native Texan and proud of it, proud Mexican-American. And I actually am also a South by Southwest photographer. And so I was additionally bereaved that South by was unfortunately canceled, and grateful for this opportunity now, even more grateful than before. I'm a statistician by training, a survey sampling statistician. I've been in survey research for about 40 years and have been working in a number of academically based research organizations, but also had an opportunity to meet our fine guest, Sam Echevarria, at New Stats, which I co-owned. It was a social science research company here in Austin, Texas, for about 6 years between, say, 2001 and 2006. For the last decade or more of my time, I've been at the Urban Institute, where I still am. I'm the chief methodologist and vice president. And I've morphed into a policy researcher. So I do stuff on census, on hunger, food hunger, and still keep a great portfolio of statistical consulting and design work. So that's me. Guess I'd like to turn it over to do a self intro of Sam, and then we'll start having some fun. Sam, tell us about yourself.
Oh, thank you. Bienvenidos a todos. It's great to be here. What a wonderful opportunity. I just want to thank all of our sponsors and supports. You know, it is good to touch as many people, reach out as we can to talk about statistics. My name is Samuel Echevarria-Cruz. I'm from the Valley, as we say, the border between Texas and Mexico, in a little town called Brownsville, Texas. I'm a proud Mexican-American, but I'm also half Puerto Rican, so I get to enjoy the diversity of the Hispanic culture. I am a statistician by training, a demographer from the University of Texas at Austin, and I've spent a varied career, both public and private sector. One of the highlights of my career was hanging out with Rob, with our hats and our boots, as we slang statistics over the West. in the private sector. From doing research, I moved into higher education, where I'm currently a dean of the Division of Liberal Arts for Social Behavioral Sciences at Austin Community College District. And so my passion is teaching. My passion is undergraduate students, as well as dual credit students. And so I'm here because, along with Rob, we see the value of statistics stretching down into the earliest grades to try to strengthen, the next generation of young people, scholars, engaged citizens. And so I just want to thank everybody and look forward to having a great interaction.
So let's start with a little bit of an intro. This is about the Superpower statistics. It's about statistical literacy and the value that it brings from K all the way through graduate school. In my mind, statistics plus anything is greater than the anything. You actually add value and insight by having a statistical literacy competency along with whatever field that you want to study in. And to kick it off, there's a little analogy that I like to give that regardless of what grade you're in, if you're in K through 12 or you're an undergrad or grad school or professional, every time that you cross the street, you have to make some calculations. You get to the edge of the street, you look both ways. You see a car coming, you have to decide how far away is it. You estimate that. You have to decide how fast is it going. You estimate that. You decide how is it safe for me at a safe pace to cross the street. You have to estimate that. You put all those different sources of uncertainty together, and you literally make a decision that depends on your life. So whether we know it or not, statistics, the management of uncertainty is embedded throughout the fabric of our life. It's ubiquitous. And we make those decisions whether we think about them consciously or not. So there really is value in learning statistics with the kids, but not just saying, hey kids, here's some stats. It's by embedding them in stories and allowing the kids to learn and discover and tell the story through statistics, because statistics enables some knowledge that can be gained and can ultimately lead to the moral of the story. So that's kind of like introduction. As you can tell, we totally love, Sam and I totally love statistics. And in fact, it reminds me of the Beatles song, All You Need Is Love. And so Sam, right, don't you think all you need is love?
I agree, all you need is love. But let's add to that, all you need is love and statistics.
There you go.
And I'd like to, you're talking about stories, and there's so many good stories we could really, but here's one that really grabbed my attention some years back. I know we're going to start sharing a PowerPoint that we have for you all.
Oh, thank you, sir. that's
and one of the stories is I was reading this book called Is the Bachelor's Degree Obsolete? Common Sense, and by a wonderful colleague named Wick Sloan. And the big theme that we'd like to talk about as we look at our PowerPoint in our next slide, the big theme is that we really want to bring to you is these initial ideas of critical thinking, creativity, insight, and equity, right? So if you can think of those four placeholders: critical thinking, creativity, insight, and equity, those are kind of ways that I like to think about how statistics can be taught and shared with young people and people across the age spectrum to get them excited about why we should be learning statistics. And one of these experiences that I had was this quote from this book by Wick Sloan, who's really critical of some of the higher ed strategies and institutional processes we've created. And if you're reading here, he says, we really have an old system of higher ed from the 14th century. But this last part that really got my attention. He wrote in this book that everyone has the critical thinking. It says we really should ensure sure that by 21 years of age, everyone should have critical thinking and language and quantitative skills to pass these two exams, the AP exam in English language and composition, and the AP exam in statistics. And I really was taken aback by that, because that first of all, I loved it, and Rob loves it, and all us statisticians love it, because yes, this should be the core of our quantitative skill set. Should really be statistics from pre-K onwards. We believe highly. But what this reminded me of is that these two components, of our intellectual and critical thinking lives, being able to speak and read and write well is a huge, huge predictor of how you can do well in an advanced society. But also being able to do statistics. And those critical thinking skills are absolutely fundamental in the 21st century and beyond. And so, this is one of those where there's just a small little data point to share with you, that if you still needed convincing, there are many other colleagues and professionals that really highlight the need for us to really embed statistical and quantitative thinking skills very early on. And so I just want to share that story, because it's still one that I carry with me daily.
Yeah, it's a great story, Sam. Thanks for offering that. It makes me think about how common sense is so important in the world of statistics and in the everyday world too. Reminds me that when I was in undergrad and then grad school, and even in my first job, I knew statistics like nobody's business. I could do the formulas, I could do proofs, I could do all that stuff. But applying it was another thing. And I always was in awe of these senior statisticians that could, you'd be presented with the statistical problem, and then suddenly they say, but why are we even doing this? It's like the so what question. And that type of critical thinking is really valuable, because it helps frame the way that you use statistics to gain insight. And it took me until I was in my 40s to learn that stuff. And once I did, I really saw how having a little bit of statistical acumen and some tools in statistics and statistical thinking really allowed me to help researchers think through their research questions. Is it really the question you want to be asking? If you want to do is a survey really the best way to address that particular research question, or do you need qualitative research for that? Those types of things. Have you found that?
Yeah, I would say it's a good point, because what I'm still surprised by, and I shouldn't be, but I teach MBA statistics, so statistics to students in an MBA program, Master's of Business Administration. And when I tell them that statistics doesn't answer questions, it's a tool for you to think both critically and creatively about new answers to old questions or new questions. They really are a little stunned, because they've been raised, as so many of us, to say, well, statistics answers your questions. I say, no, statistics is a tool to beef up your critical thinking skills so that you can ask better questions. And statistics will always be there to help you get information on the question you're asking. So yeah, I think you're exactly right. It comes to maturity, but we can do so much to teach young people, students across the range of ages, about how this is a tool that you want to use for the right project, right? For the right approach. And, we are statisticians, but we would be remiss if we didn't mention qualitative data gathering is as or more critical. I became a statistician because it's a lot easier to do that than the real hard work of qualitative data gathering and analysis. So those people are special because you really can't answer any question unless you talk to people and understand processes. So, Rob, that reminds me of this Rolling Stones song that I love. You can't always get what you want. We're talking about, what we'd like. But I bet you have a story around something like that.
Actually, I do have a story around all that. And interestingly, it has to do with statistics, and it has to do with an area of the country that is involved in the COVID crisis, specifically the Bronx. But as a precursor to that, let me throw out this little slide here. It happens, I'm in the corner there looking sideways at my cousin Chicky. My sister's next to me and my other cousin. And what's really interesting is that Facebook several years back, maybe even more than half a decade ago, created an algorithm, a statistical algorithm that allowed one to use visual data in order to pinpoint the identity of individuals. It's now a big privacy issue in China and maybe someday in the US, hopefully not. But it allows you, just by posting a picture, it will suggest for you, oh, did you mean to tag this person? And Margaret Martin is my sister, so it was ready to tag my sister. And it shows how the application of statistics and, in predictive analytics, with big data, can actually have some really nice, cool benefits in this day and age. But there's a flip side too, and that brings me to the Bronx story. Having said all of that, the Bronx is burning. This is a picture by Vernon Schibla back in the 1970s. It's off a New York Post article in 2010, and it told the story of statistics gone wrong, which is a good lesson in statistical thinking and pragmatism and common sense. What happened is that, let me just make sure, I don't think I have another slide now. What happened is that back in '71, there was still a lot of concern about budgets, city budgets in New York City. And so the mayor of New York commissioned a research organization, very prominent, I won't say the name, to do some highfalutin statistical analysis, regressions, etc., at the time that really weren't being used with administrative data. And the administrative data were fire incidents in the Bronx and basically New York City as a whole, the time it took to go from the station to the fire, and other types of data elements. And they went through to do an analysis to determine where stations could either be moved to a more optimal location, or some could just be shut down altogether, in order so that the city budget could be lowered, yet the safety and effectiveness of firefighting could go on. Well, they did their analysis. The mayor embraced all of that, basically then put it onto the fire department, and they basically said, you guys are going to shut down these stations and you're going to move these other ones. And some interesting predictions or recommendations came out of this analysis that included moving stations that actually had a lot of activity over to a part of the city, Staten Island, where there wasn't very much. But according to the numbers, they basically, that's what had to be done. Well, lo and behold, over the course of the next few years, the Bronx, pretty much burned down. There were 7, let's see, I had some statistics here. There were 7 census tracts in which more than 97% of the structures within those census tracts were abandoned or caught fire and then were abandoned as a result between 1970 and 1980. And 44 additional census tracts lost almost half of their structures from fires. And that's because the firefighters couldn't get to them in time. And when all was said and done, everybody was scrambling, okay, what the heck's going on? It turned out that the analysis was conducted, the findings were made, and recommendations were given but they didn't talk to the fire departments. They didn't talk to the chiefs. They didn't talk to some of the firefighters. There was no essentially community engagement to see if the findings were being interpreted right, if they made sense, just like, does it pass the last test even? And what they would have found out quickly is that they didn't pass the last test because of underlying assumptions. Though the principal dependent variable happened to be the amount of time it took to get to the incident. And though that assumption included with it that at any point in time, a fire station always had equipment and people to send to the fire. Well, that's never the case. Anyone talking to anyone in FDNY knows that this band of brothers and sisters, they help each other out. So it's not unusual for a station to have all of its equipment out for long periods of time because they're fighting their fire in their own jurisdiction, so to speak, but they're also helping out a neighboring area too. And so all of this came down, with a crash, and it taught us a valuable lesson that community engagement is essential in interpreting and interpreting findings and making recommendations. Because had they done that, those types of recommendations of closures and movement of stations would never have happened, and most of the South Bronx would have been spared as a result. So that's my little statistic story of the Bronx's burning. What do you think, Sam?
It's a powerful story. I mean, we've got those underlying and obvious issues of having the right voices in the room when we use statistics, when we gather them, when we interpret them, and then we apply them. And that should be one of the most important lessons to students, is that, again, statistics are a tool that require context. They require a narrative. They require many voices to make them meaningful. And I think later on we're going to talk a little bit more about the issue of equity, and I think that's an incredible opening to that as we'll wrap up. But so yeah, thank you for that story, and it just reminds me of how careful we need to be, especially as statisticians, that if we don't teach and if we don't share those approaches, we will not leverage statistics for what they can be used for.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been for over 10 years doing a fighter fire safety and protection study with DHS grant funding and with International Firefighters Association, some nonprofits, Worcester Polytech, University of Texas even. And it's interesting, we've dealt with these types of issues. And early on in the project, like 10 years ago, just for the fun of it, I did a little regression of we're looking at loss of property and injuries to firefighters and people in the community from structure fires, people's homes catching fire. And if you did the analysis, we wanted to look at what type of crew sizes and how many pieces of equipment do you send out? Do the crews that you send out on a truck, are they like 3, 4, 5, or 6 or whatever? And what we found was that and it was a really strong correlation. The fewer the pieces of equipment that you send, the smaller the damage and the lower the risk of casualties. Why? Well, because it's really interesting. Because the smaller the fire is, you're not going to send, you're not going to make it a 3-alarm fire and send a bunch of equipment. If it's a tiny little fire there and it's reported that way, they're going to send, to the standard small issue. The larger fires that have more damage, they send more equipment and more personnel to. So rather than coming up with a recommendation that, if you want to reduce damage and casualties, send fewer firefighters and equipment. That would have been one way of interpreting those results. But we knew better because we had firefighters engaged in our research. And so that was an interesting corollary to what we're doing.
Yep.
So have anything else to add, or shall we move on?
Yeah, let's move on, because you really hit on the issue of interpretation, and so much about statistics is both critical thinking and creativity, and part of the aspect of creativity is interpretation. How do we, where do we go, and how do we find the information that helps us interpret these statistics and then make decisions that can affect hundreds, thousands, of tens of thousands of lives? And so that's where the interpretation part. And so I was curious, because I always like to look at the lives of young people. We're in this pandemic, and so many of the memes out there about how different generations are dealing with the pandemic. Generation X and boomers and things like that. And I try not to get too caught up in generational debates, because there's artificiality and there's arbitrary to how we define the generations. It only hits home, excuse me, it only hits home when my teenage sons call me a boomer, and I take somewhat offense. Yeah, because I'm Generation X, and I've got a stake in all this. But our next slides, I like to embed the issue of insights, and I always try to bring data that applies to let's say high school students. And so I pulled 3 slides here to look at some interesting trends. These are just real simple statistics that should lead us to think more deeply about interpretation or next steps. And one of them that we're seeing here is and many of you may know this, but the issue of sexual behavior among high school students is dropping precipitously over time. And this is from 2007 to 2017. You can see almost an 8 percentage point drop there. And a lot of people are asking these questions, and psychologists are looking at this, and sociologists and human development folks and economists and all sorts of people. But we need to be, we want to ask good questions. What is driving this? What's behind these numbers? And one of the issues is this generational differences. Is it possible that the iPhone and other smartphone technologies plus social media have led to a real change in how young people both use their time, but also think about themselves? And some have generally turned, especially in psychology, they've turned this the elongated path to adulthood. And we've heard about this for many generations, or I should say for many decades, that the hallmark markers of adulthood, graduating high school, getting your license, buying your first car or home, obviously getting married and having your first child, that those are all happening later in life on average. But it does beg the question whether the cell phone, for example, the smartphone, has really changed the way. And there's some evidence that this is the case. I didn't put a slide here, but data that on average young people are taking longer to get their licenses. And that's because there seems to be less of an impulse or less of a desire for young people to get physically together, as Rob and I did growing up. I went to the mall on the weekends to hang out with my friends, and if I didn't have a license, you had to drive me there. And so obviously I was beholden to my parents, and for so many generations, getting that license is a huge hallmark of independence and adulthood in a sense. But for younger people today, maybe the phone has changed that. And so this isn't just, have you ever had sex? Although you can see that in the next slide, we see that also some other hallmarks. Drinking alcohol has declined. And I decided sometimes it's important not to look at 10 years, but look at much longer time periods. Here you see that from 1991, we've just seen this steady decline that seems to have become more steep in the latter years of this graph. And so as some say, 2007 is when the iPhone came out. You want to put a line right on 2007 to see, is there really the case that maybe the smartphone technology, and I think most of us have a sense that something is different, but what is different requires interpretation, and how we're going to view the differences are going to be meaningful. But as you can see here, based on 2017, the lowest number recorded in terms of alcohol. And then finally, this next slide, we see that working, this is a percentage of youth who have worked from 1993 to 2018. And as you can see, you see this jumping and movement, but the bottom graph there, the dotted line, is enrolled in high school. And that is where you see a huge drop for those enrolled in high school having summer jobs or jobs during the year. That has dropped precipitously. And again, our economy has changed. Of course, the Great Recession changes a lot of things, but also are there psychosocial factors, are there demographic factors that have made young people live in some ways qualitatively different lives than previous generations at those same ages. And I love sharing these statistics with young people and say, you tell me, what do you think these mean, right? Because you're living this. And I don't want to make those interpretations. I don't want to make any decisions without talking to you, right? You're the ones who know best. And so, you know, one story that really grabbed my attention, especially as an educator, was in my online classes and in many of my classes where I require students to post short essays, the level of unuse or non-use of punctuation, as many of us in higher ed have seen, it was decreasing. And I had noticed that, especially teaching dual credit, that it had become even more so. And I was really curious. I was like, well, what's going on? Again, I didn't know. But one day I'm driving my 17-year-old to school, and he's furiously banging away on his phone. And I said, what are you doing? And he's like, oh, I'm writing this essay. I'm typing this essay out. I said, what do you mean? He's like, yeah, I'm just typing it and I'm gonna submit it using my smartphone. And I said, do you do this often? He goes, yeah, all the time. And so, I mean, that offended me as a father. It offended me as a academic, you know. But then I realized, oh my goodness, this is what our young people are doing. They're leveraging their technology for what seems to be very valid reasons. And I, as an educator, need to look at those statistics and make sure that I change. You know, some of this, much of this responsibility is on me to change how I approach this education. So, you know, Rob, those are some of the stories that have come out of when I think about in interpreting. And I know you have some powerful ones in terms of other stories about how the community needs to understand statistics.
And I'll get to that, but I'm really captivated by your story. So thank you for telling it. It suggests to me that it's when you do statistics, you have to have a cultural understanding. There needs to be some cultural relevance in the interpretation of the findings. So in your case, you were looking at kids. The same happens if you're looking at groups of immigrants, or if you're looking at African Americans or the Latinx population, or just the general population, folks who work, folks who don't work, folks who are disabled. Everyone has their own lens that guides them to do what they do, like decide to work or not work. And we need to understand that so that we can properly use the statistical tools in order to interpret the findings. This particular graph that you have makes me wonder, think about it. We're in a new world. We're in the COVID world. The next 10 years, what is this particular graph going to look like? Because kids aren't going to necessarily be able to have jobs, at least over the course of the next couple of years. Maybe not. I mean, I'm suspecting that it's going to be very different, that the nature of employment, how it happens, since a lot of it's going to be done and pushed out to be from home, as opposed to in a facility, that's all going to make these types of patterns look very different. And it's going to also change the way that people think about work. Whether you're an adult, whether you're a kid, a high school kid, or or young adult or elderly, it's really going to have a major impact. And we need to keep that in mind as we move forward and try to learn about what's good policy for rebooting in a post-COVID world and things of that sort. What do you think?
Yeah, no, good point. I mean, right now, all of us, but especially the community college, we have a big question mark. Are students going to show up to all online offerings at the same rates? We'll be going online this summer, and everyone across the nation is having discussions about, will we go all online in the fall? And we don't know what those offerings will do to enrollments.
Yeah.
And we don't know what young people and our traditional aged, you know, students, are they going to want those offerings? Are they going to want them at the same rate? We have no idea. And so you're right. This has changed dynamically everything that we've assumed and built whole institutions around. And we're seeing that. Everyone is seeing that, unfortunately, in a very real way.
Yeah. And sort of wrapping this back into the superpower of statistics and students, these are the types of stories that students can be told, and you can engage in really useful conversations so that it's not a matter of here's a graph, what does the graph tell you? It's a matter of, okay, today we're going to talk about, you know, civic engagement, or we're going to talk about employment in the world. Here's something to take a look at. Let's see how current events are influencing this. And you guys have conversations, you know, with the students. It really gets to the whole idea, you know, should there be separate math classes and statistics classes from English classes and history classes and civics classes? Or should you really try to integrate them so that statistics really becomes valuable at the time that they are needed as a tool to promulgate wisdom and insight.
Yeah.
So the next story that I had that you asked me about, Sam, I'd like to tell. It's a quick story, so I won't take a lot of time, and we can keep going with this fun stuff. And it's about community policing. I don't have any statistical graphs, but I do have a story. Back a few years back, there was a police shooting in the community in Austin, my dear Austin, and the communities that tend to have concentrations of Latinos and African Americans were expressing their angst that there's profiling going on. Why are we doing this? We need to, you know, we need a better understanding between policing and the community in order to get through this period. Otherwise, it's just going to be killing after killing, and things are going to get out of hand, etc. And so there was a program that went on to bring together community leaders, members of the police force, including the police chief, members of city council, and then have meetings in the community. So it's not a matter of community people have to go off to City Hall. Instead, you play, you know, in the community center, you know, a block away, there's going to be a meeting. Let's go talk. And they went through some of that, and associated with that was a survey of the community. These particular communities that were had concentrations of people of color, and were experiencing this issue. And the survey asked about people's perceptions of the police force, and, you know, were they really being you know, essentially racist and profiling, and what value did the police bring to the community and such. And we did something in the spirit of community engagement. We did the survey and took the results, made up a bunch of charts with graphs. It was all data viz, and then had both the members of the police community and members of the neighborhoods come view the graphs and talk to each other about what the graphs were saying. What were the findings? And what does it mean in terms of recommendation? I'm using my hands too much. And so, don't laugh. Sam was always on me for that. Okay, so there was a finding that was real curious. On the one hand, the community members truly felt that there was profiling going on, and they thought that something needed to be done about that. On the other hand, there was another graph that said the community really valued the police and how, you know, they protect the community, and the police and us researchers were saying, okay, you know, the survey must have gone wrong. Maybe we didn't ask it the right way, because these things don't jive. Either you love the police or you hate them. Okay, what gives? And the community people were saying, no, you don't get it. Look, when there's a bad person at the door trying to break in, we love it that we can call the police and they're going to come and they're going to protect us. Having said that, when I walk out the door to go get some groceries, I don't want to be profiled. I mean, don't you understand? The two things that you think are diametrically opposed are actually very consistent. And the only way we would have found that consistency and get that type of insight is if we would have allowed the community to come in and help interpret the findings and help provide really meaningful recommendations as a result. So that's our police story. So
it's a
at this point,
one.
I guess, Emily, were there any questions that we would want to take at this point before we move on?
Sure, we're getting a couple of questions in, and if you have a question that you have not submitted, please, you can pop those in at any time using the Q&A chat feature at the bottom of the screen. One question I can answer quickly myself is if the digital copy of the slides will be available after this presentation. And the good news is that this entire session is being recorded, so you can view the slides and the full presentation anytime after this. You should be able to access that through the This is Statistics YouTube channel, or we'll be linking it from the This is Statistics website. So you can look for it there in the near future. And a second question we had come in is just about introducing statistics to children. So AJ has a 5-year-old and is interested in how to best introduce his son to these ideas for this age level. So websites, books, other tools or methods, if you've got any ideas on that.
Well, I'll start off, but Sam is our educator, so I'll let him take the helm mostly. But the This is Statistics website actually has a number of resources. So if you simply Google This is Statistics, I believe it's thisisstatistics.org, but Emily will correct me if I'm wrong. Okay, you can then find different resources that are available depending on whether you're doing pre-K, not pre-K, but kindergarten versus elementary, middle school versus high school, and so forth. So I would highly recommend that as a resource. And then Sam, if you have any ideas or suggestions, feel free to add.
No, I'm just going to echo that This is Statistics has a wealth of information there, even obviously lessons at the high school level. So do, mathematics, secondary education groups, and we can post some of those as well, but I would start with This is Statistics. Looking at the research, the best way to start a 5-year-old or any young person, I think, are two separate, but obviously important dimensions of statistics. One is probability, and that really is about the idea that randomness and what we call independent probability is so key for understanding and getting us away. Research shows that most Americans don't do probability very well, right? We all labor under the gambler's fallacy that if A happened a lot, then B is going to happen next. And A and B aren't connected, right? They're flipping coins. And so I do with my children, and I know other educators have started, just, you take different color objects, put them in a bag and start pulling them out and show a young person over and over again that you're going to get the same sort of distribution, as we say. The next thing is data visualization, just having young people either coloring or with blocks, getting used to the idea of creating 2- and 3-dimensional pictures of data. And that's really going to be key as we move forward. I mean, this is about statistics, but truth be told, we're moving into a world of data analytics, meaning probability isn't nearly as important as it used to be because we have all the data. So often our organizations are tracking all the data, and we can what we need is creative model creative thinking when it comes to modeling, so we don't make many of the mistakes that we've talked about here. So great questions.
Excellent.
Thanks so much. And we had one more come in relevant to the story that you've most recently shared here. Can you please share the data you're referring to for the community policing survey?
Yes, we can. It's through the Urban Institute, and we can provide both the slides that we had that will include links to those particular resources. So thank you for asking, and we'll definitely do that. Okay, so Sam, we're coming to the backstretch of our webinar here, and it reminds me of the Dylan song, "Oh, the times they are a-changin'." There's a lot of stuff going on in the world, and a lot of it deals with something that I know is near and dear to both of our hearts, because we have done work to advance equity in the world and in our society. And we've both experienced, discrimination and everything that comes with that. So I was hoping that you could share a story about equity, and then we can maybe I can, if there's time, I'll do one as well, and we can talk about the role, the really important role that statistics has in telling stories of equity, inequity, and what we need to do about it.
So before we get to this slide here, which could take a little bit of explanation, I want to tell a personal story about equity and statistics. As an undergraduate, I was able to be a part of a research group, undergraduate research fellowship at the University of Texas at Austin. And what that did is they put an undergraduate in graduate program with researchers and graduate students who talked about their work. And you were just there to really learn and see if you were interested in moving down this path. And I remember one meeting as an undergraduate, one of my first meetings, I was in a room with 8 faculty and graduate students talking about Hispanic data, Hispanic research. This is a group looking at Hispanic demographic trends. And they found this data point and they couldn't interpret it. They had no idea how or what it meant. And it had to do with social support and communities. And I'm sitting there as a 19-year-old from the border, and I meekly raised my hand and I said, I know how to interpret that. And they all looked at me, and I explained it to them, because what they were looking at was something I had experienced in my own communities about social support. And I was the only Latino in the room. And I remember the professor who ended up being my mentor, he said to everyone, this is why we have a problem, because there are no voices of people of color, and we are charged with studying and producing and interpreting statistics. And obviously I felt very engaged in that moment. But this is one of those important lessons. We want to make sure, especially as we introduce statistics to especially students of color and marginalized groups, that we need to even increase their desire to be voices in the room, because the interpretation of statistics affects us politically, psychologically, socially, economically. And I know we're going to get to this idea of the census. We have to, because it is the most important statistical lesson that we have. And so that's a personal story that leads me to this slide. I'm looking at data, and so often we look at data in a very simplistic way. And equity demands that we start to look at data with much more complexity and nuance. And one of those things that I have a problem with is when we just look at data and look at, for example, these, I haven't shown it here, but if you look at data by race, ethnicity among students at a community college like Austin Community College, we see that students of color in certain courses are doing not as well as what we call non-Hispanic white students, right? So the students who these are these race ethnic categories we look at. But I decided to look at this more intently by using multivariate analysis. And as you can see here, what I show is that for these courses that are really important to us at a community college, English, Comp 1, English, Comp 2, government, US history, US government, Texas government, history 1 and 2, and algebra, and then at the end here, psychology. When you take into account, and you want to look at equity, when you take into account a bunch of controls, as I have listed here at the bottom, one important idea is that race is actually, in some of these cases, students of color have an advantage. And one of the highlights was that the Black students, African-American students in English Comp 1 or English 1301 are 5 points more likely to succeed in that class than their non-Hispanic white colleagues and peers. And so what that tells us is if we don't start looking at data the right way, especially when it comes to issues of equity and race, for example, we really set ourselves up to look at students of color in a deficit framework, not an advantage framework. And this is the way statistics have been unfortunately used since the beginning, since the 1800s moving onward, whereas we often focus on race differences without taking into account other variables, specifically economic context variables. And so when we explore and introduce statistics to young students in elementary school, we need to embed right away that you must look at many variables, because we have a society that has already tended to default to certain narratives and certain stories about racial differences or sex differences, gender differences, etc., that need to really be nuanced and understood in a much more complex way. And so, and this table shows some other things that, Asian is a problematic category because it's a catch-all for a diverse set of Asian cultures, just like Hispanic is another challenging catch-all. Being Puerto Rican and Mexican, I can tell you, we fight all the time, us Puerto Ricans and Mexicans, right? If we have the chance. So we need to be very careful. But even then, just this model minority myth, we just assume Asians do well, and yeah, they do well in algebra, but they are struggling in some of these other courses relative to their non-Hispanic white peers. And so we don't have any supports. We don't have any equity-based supports for different students of color, or especially Asian students of color, that we want to be mindful of moving forward. So, that's just something that is a simple example of how we need to be. We can use statistics as a far more a powerful tool than oftentimes we ever do, especially in education.
Do you have another slide? Or is that it?
I don't think so. Nope.
Okay, good. Hey, well, thank you for that, Sam. Yeah, I've encountered some similar things. I was actually in a National Academies panel that looked at fraud in the representative payee system. So if you're getting Social Security and you don't have a bank account, because you're homeless, or you're in a nursing home and you don't really have access, and this was like before the days of cell phone banking, then you need somebody to do that for you. And so you sign over basically someone to manage your finances. And that's the Social Security representee. The charge of the committee was to find ways of predicting and helping identify where the fraud occurred. So they had this, Social Security Administration has these massive databases, and you can get all these different data elements, including race, ethnicity, and other types of things, geography and age, and so forth. And at the beginning, everyone is supposed to talk about their biases when you're on these panels. It's a really wonderful thing. I think people should do that more often when they just do any type of research project. And when it came to me, I basically said, we will, because I was really, I was totally passionate about this. I said, look, if we are good statisticians, we are not going to come up with a predictive model that says if you're Black or Hispanic, then you have you should go look at those people because they have the highest rates of fraud in these types of representation situations. I said it may or may not be the case that there are more in those situations, but we won't be doing our jobs unless we dig underneath race and ethnicity and identify other attributes, like if they're renters or if they're in nursing homes or if they're in this and that. And we actually successfully did that because I wasn't going to inadvertently contribute to a structural racism event. I just made sure that that didn't happen. And in fact, it didn't. So it was a nice way to get through that.
Well, Rob, you're in a unique position, having those experiences, being in a national policy level. But I would love our final minutes here to really, if you could summarize the challenges of what you're knee deep in right now, and that is the census.
Oh, sure.
What's going on with the census?
Well, the 2020 census, as you know, is underway. It's mandated by the Constitution. There is no choice but to conduct it in 2020. And in fact, it started in March. But there accompanies with it some real equity issues that people just aren't talking about. 2020 census, as most of, I hope most of us know, is mandatory. You have to participate by law. And it has associated with it these benefits. And the benefits are political representation, because your state gets the congressional allocations on the basis of the counts per state. And secondly, there's lots, billions and trillions of dollars over the course of a decade of federal funds that flow through the states to local communities as a result of the 2020 census and its little data partners, the American Community Survey and Current Population Survey and so forth. So this is really important. Oh, and the final thing is political representation. The counts are used within a state then to create the boundaries, both state legislative boundaries as well as congressional districts. So it's really important to get the maximum amount of participation. And the thing that Latinos and African Americans and Asians and folks dread most is an inequity in the counting process. So in 2010, it was declared the most accurate census ever based on an independent estimate that the Census Bureau did. But what really happened is that they overcounted about 16 million people and undercounted about 16 million. The people that they undercounted tended to be African Americans, Latinos, renters that move about, immigrants and so forth. But the people that were overcounted tended to be elderly, white suburbia, folks that had 2 homes, things of that sort. So there's a real issue going on. Given COVID, I believe that it's only going to exacerbate the historical differential undercounting like that is occurring in our country. Thank goodness that the census collection period has been now extended or is about to be extended until October. And the counts aren't going to be, hopefully aren't going to be submitted until April of next year, the end of April instead of the end of December. So to give a little bit more flavor, I picked my native state of Texas, and I show you this graph of the state of Texas. And if you see the blue, that shows you the concentration in percentages of Hispanic population in 2017. It's pretty much the same now. And it shows you that all along the Rio Grande border and in El Paso, et cetera, with pockets in San Antonio, a little bit in Houston and such, you have concentrations of Latinos. Now, why does that matter? Well, if you take the census research and you look nationally at their findings for Latinos, Asians, African Americans, Native Americans, whites, the ethnic racial groups for 2000 and 2010, and you plot it against something called self-reports. That's this y-axis here, and you see that these dots up here are higher than 75 to 85% of self-reporting. Self-reporting is when people mail back their forms, or in this case, do it online. And these dots over here are lower rates of households from people of color that tend to self-respond. So you have some, these are probably Native Americans at 60% who are the lowest, and then you have maybe African Americans and Latinos. Now this line that comes down the middle shows you an accurate count. That's 0, over or under count. On the right-hand side, where you have high self-response, people responding, that's where you get the overcounts. And on the left-hand side, you get minus, 2%, minus 1% undercount of really people of color. That is important because if you look, that basically shows you, I'll go back, that there is a relationship, a correlation between how much or at what rates households respond and and what might occur in terms of an over or under count. Once you go below, say 70%, you're at risk of being undercounted as a population, subpopulation. Well, if you look at this map, this is the Rome map. It's a census predicted male non-response. And the darker areas are areas that tended to self-respond, where households didn't submit forms as much. And the lighter areas are areas where they exceeded expectation. They really did well. Texas as a whole doesn't do very well, but they're especially bad along the Rio Grande Valley and in some parts of San Antonio and Austin, little pieces in Houston and such. And if you see that, these are the areas and the communities that we will expect to be most at risk of being undercounted. And that happens to correspond a lot to Latino communities. So the net story here is that there is an equity issue going on with our civic duty to be in the decennial census, which is constitutionally mandated. And to the extent that we don't respond, we're going to be at risk of being undercounted. To the extent that we're undercounted, we'll lose out on political representation, we'll lose out on federal funding. And our communities, like where schools are located, where clinics go, economic development, if they don't know that you're there, they don't know that there's workers there, that they won't put a factory there, things of that sort. So it's using visualizations like this can help tell a story that's pretty easily understandable to school kids, to high school, to undergrads, about one, the value of statistics as a tool to help gain insight, and secondly, how statistical literacy as a student can really help you be a better person, because you'll understand these types of issues, and hopefully that'll motivate you to participate. So that was my story.
And you predicted my question. That is, who could understand that? And I'm so glad you mentioned, right? Middle schoolers, probably advanced elementary age school children in the older grades, high schoolers, and of course undergraduates and community members. Being able to quickly and easily visualize and explain these numbers. It's all about empowerment. It's all about empowering all of us to approach statistics with more confidence, but also with more hope for a better future. And so, thank you for that example. It encourages me and it pushes me to get more involved in telling people and doing what I can in my community to make sure that those response rates are as high as possible.
And ladies and gentlemen, that is why statistics is the superpower that every student needs. Emily, do we have any final questions?
Yes, thank you so much for that. This was such a wonderful presentation with such good stories in it. We do have a handful of questions. Looking at the time, I think I have a really good one for us to conclude on today. And that question is, how can we better understand the data that we come across in society, in our daily lives, as we digest it?
I'm happy to take that answer. And Sam, I know Sam's has other things to say too, but this is a particular interest of mine, because I do believe that statistics is ubiquitous in our society, and that we are consumers of statistics, whether we realize it or not. The one piece of advice that I could give is consumer be aware, like buyer be aware, buyer awareness or whatever. And it's not a matter of warning to distrust, but it's a matter of using the data for the purpose that it's intended and not trying to overuse it. So looking at, say, political polls, as you go towards, the election. Well, what really matters is what happens on voting day, not necessarily what happens on election day. And polls always are based when they're doing this forecasting who they think they're going to win. They have to predict who's going to vote or not. So there's likely voter models, and so you have to remember that there are baked into a lot of the statistics that we consume in everyday life, additional uncertainties that transcend the little margin of error that folks provide. So keep in mind that there's inherent uncertainty in everything, and that margins of error that are often posted are only for one type of error, sampling error. And there are many other types of errors. There's how you ask the question. There's whether the person understood it or not, or just wanted to give you an answer so they could move on to the next question and get an incentive or whatever. So just keep in mind that you shouldn't overuse. You should be properly aware that there are very few total truths in life. No statistic is totally accurate. They all have underlying assumptions. Think through what those assumptions might be, and then use the information accordingly. The last piece I'll say is that I once told a reporter, if you're at the beach and you see a tsunami coming, you don't need to know that it's 24.5693 inches high, coming at you at 54.95 miles an hour. All you need to know is that it's a big damn wave coming fast at you, and you better get out of there. So you don't need very precise information to make good decisions, and keep that in mind too. Sam?
Yeah, no, I'm going to agree. If I had one lesson, it's always transparency. And that is, as advanced consumers, we, unlike you and I earlier in our lives, we have the ability, or should have the ability, to find the source of almost all data that's presented to us that's trying to convince us of some argument or some policy. And I tell every person I talk to, if you can't find that data, you need to be much more buyer beware. And so we live in a world where transparency should really reign supreme. And government data is usually pretty transparent, and nonprofit data. And so we just need to be aware that if I can't find the source of that data, I personally, I'd like to see the data myself always, but I'm a statistician. And so that's what drives me. But I tell everyone, if someone is transparent enough to say, this is the data, this is how we collected it, that builds your confidence in it.
And I guess with that, we'll say that we'll post whatever we need to, including links through This is Statistics, if that's okay, Emily. And then I'll sign off myself by saying we live in a COVID world, so I hope you are all safe and sound in your homes. And if not, if you have to get out, that you're taking the proper precautions. We're all in this together, so wishing the best to you. Sam?
Thank you all very much. Again, healthy, be safe, be as wise as you can, and explore some statistical resources out there. There's so many great free classes, free online resources. Don't be scared. It's fun. Once you get into it, you'll never stop.
Saludos, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.